I was halfway through a cannonball into my own pool when I heard her scream, like someone had just seen a shark in the deep end. That was the exact moment HOA Karen burst through my side gate, holding her phone like it was a badge of authority, and yelled at the top of her lungs, "You're trespassing on HOA property, and I got the cops on speed dial." I landed with a splash so loud it drowned out her next sentence, but by the time I popped my head above water, she was already pacing on my deck like she owned the place. The best part? I wasn't even in her HOA. It had been a blisteringly hot Saturday, and I was finally getting a well-earned break. I had just mowed the front and backyard, trimmed the hedges, and finally fixed the wobbly pool ladder that had been bothering me for a week. My plan was simple: float, relax, and not speak to a single soul for at least 2 hours. That fantasy ended the moment Karen's rubber flip-flops slapped against my concrete like a storm warning. She was wearing her usual visor, giant sunglasses, and a floral shirt that looked like it was stitched out of anger. Her phone was already aimed at me, and she was recording, narrating the whole situation like she was hosting a documentary on backyard criminals. And here we have the neighborhood trespasser, illegally using a pool on HOA property, she declared. This is going straight to the board. I swam slowly to the side, blinking the chlorine out of my eyes as I pulled myself out of the pool. "Karen, this is my house," I said, grabbing a towel. She didn't flinch. "This land falls under HOA jurisdiction," she snapped. "That pool is technically communal space. We had a vote." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, my property isn't part of your HOA. It never was. I live outside the boundary line. You're literally trespassing right now." That's when she huffed, stomped toward the gate, and dialed 911. About 10 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies showed up. One was chewing gum like he was trying to win a contest, and the other already looked sunburnt and annoyed. Karen ran up to them like she was about to win an award for community service. And that's when things got even weirder. She was flagging down an ambulance officer. "That man is trespassing on HOA property. He refuses to leave the pool and is violating community standards." The officers raised their eyebrows and looked past her to me. I gave a small wave. "I live here," I said. "Want to see my deed?" They walked in, and I handed over a manila folder from the outdoor cabinet with my property documents. The 2 deputies stepped aside and began making calls while Karen crossed her arms and stared daggers into me like I was the villain in a soap opera. After a few minutes, the taller deputy came back, scratching his head. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we just confirmed with county records. This property is not part of your HOA. In fact, it never has been. It's been privately owned with no association dues or regulations since the development started." Karen's jaw unhinged like she was trying to argue with gravity itself. "That can't be right," she snapped. "We had a map," the board said. The officer cut her off. "The board doesn't set county records, ma'am. You filed a false report. That's a serious offense." I couldn't help it, a laugh slipped out. Karen spun toward me like she wanted to bite a hole through time. "This isn't over," she spat, practically foaming. "You'll regret embarrassing me." She stormed out the same way she came in, through a gate that clearly said private property, and trespassing. The irony practically burned a hole in the sign. I dried off in silence, watching the officers get back in their car. One of them gave me a sympathetic nod. "You'd be surprised how often this happens," he muttered. I wasn't surprised. Karen had always been a neighborhood legend, the kind of person who measured grass with a ruler and once reported someone's Halloween decorations for being spiritually disruptive. But this was new. Later that night, I poured myself a cold drink and sat out by the pool, staring at the stars. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. That once she realized I wasn't under her rulebook, she'd back off and find someone else to micromanage. But the next morning, I found a folded note stuffed into my mailbox. It was written in bright pink marker on the back of a church bulletin. It read, "Asterisk, you're setting a bad example for the neighborhood. Consider joining the HOA before things get difficult." Asterisk. No name, no signature, but the tone? All Karen. I laughed, shook my head, and dropped it into the trash. But in my gut, I knew this wasn't about pool rules. This wasn't about boundaries or regulations. This was about control. Karen couldn't stand the fact that someone nearby lived free of her imaginary rulebook. And when people like that lose control, they don't walk away, they dig in. So I did what anyone with half a brain and a full sense of humor would do. I upgraded my security system, added 2 new cameras, and installed a video doorbell. I had a feeling I'd be needing it. After all, if Karen wanted to play HOA police, I was happy to give her a front row seat, right before the real authorities stepped in. The next week would turn into a full-blown circus. But at that moment, still wrapped in my towel and sipping lemonade by the pool, she thought she'd won. Owned. I just smiled. Karen had no idea what was coming, and this time, the only thing about to get soaked was her dignity. The following morning started off calm. Birds chirped, the sun rose gently over the rooftops, and I was sipping my coffee while watching the motion-triggered footage from the night before. Just a casual check, nothing serious. But halfway through the video, I nearly spilled my mug. There, in grainy night vision, was Karen creeping down the sidewalk in her house robe, holding what looked like a flashlight and a stack of paper. She stopped right at the edge of my property, glanced around like she was a secret agent, and then bent down near my mailbox. I fast-forwarded. She stuffed one of those ridiculous handwritten violation notices into the box and bolted like she'd just committed a bank heist. The paper was waiting for me by the time I walked outside. It was folded in half and taped shut with a neon sticker that read, "Immediate action required." I peeled it open. Inside was a poorly copied version of a Homeowners Association letterhead. She'd clearly printed it off the internet. The fine this time was $250 for a new offense she'd made up called unauthorized splash distribution. According to her, I was disturbing the peace by creating waves larger than allowed by community standard. I looked over at my empty pool, then back at the paper and laughed out loud. Karen was officially unhinged. But what really got me wasn't just the absurdity. It was that she clearly thought I'd just roll over and take it. That afternoon, I stopped by the real HOA office. Not hers. Not Karen's delusional mini-government, but the actual board that ran the properties within their mapped jurisdiction. I walked in holding a folder full of Karen's fake notices and asked to speak to someone about a neighbor who was impersonating them. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Janet, with a deep sigh permanently in her tone, looked over the papers and immediately groaned. Her words were simple and exhausted. "Oh no, not again." She explained that Karen had been removed from any official HOA roles nearly 2 years ago after a series of complaints and internal conflict. Apparently, she'd kept acting as if she were still in charge, ignoring cease and desist notices and harassing people, many of whom weren't even under their jurisdiction. When I told Janet that my home wasn't part of the HOA at all, she looked genuinely horrified. Later that week, I started finding more Karengrams stuffed under my welcome mat, left on my car windshield, even pinned to my fence with clothespins. One told me to remove my wind chimes, claiming they were a noise violation. Another accused me of hosting unauthorized wildlife because I had a bird feeder. But the moment that truly crossed the line came 2 days later when I received a visit from animal control. The officer, a quiet man with a clipboard and a calm voice, told me someone had reported my property for housing aggressive pets. I blinked at him, confused. "Pets?" I asked. The only animals I had were the squirrels that raided the birdseed. He asked if I owned a pit bull, a parrot, or a goat. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Apparently, the anonymous report described all 3. I invited him into the backyard, showed him the nothingness, the bird bath, and my entirely non-threatening inflatable flamingo. The officer apologized and left, visibly annoyed that his time had been wasted. I knew without a doubt who made the call. Karen wasn't just playing games now. She was escalating. And while I could have let it go, something inside me clicked. If she wanted a battle of paperwork and authority, fine. I was ready to go all in. I went straight to the county records office and requested a full property line survey. I had the documents emailed to me and printed in color, large enough to frame. My house, lot, and pool were clearly marked, entirely outside of any HOA boundary lines. I didn't just own my property. I was completely unaffiliated. The paper was my golden ticket. I made copies. One for the sheriff, one for the HOA, and a special one, laminated, just for Karen. The next neighborhood HOA meeting was scheduled for that Thursday night in the community clubhouse. I wasn't technically part of it, but since Karen had dragged me into the mess and started distributing her fake notices all over town, I figured it was only fair that I attend. I walked in with my documents, nodded to Janet, and took a seat near the back. The room was packed. It seemed I wasn't the only one with Karen problems. The moment her name was mentioned on the agenda, the energy shifted. Everyone leaned forward. And then Karen walked in. She strutted like a peacock, holding her clipboard and looking smug. She sat near the front and started whispering to two other residents, who looked just as fed up. When her turn to speak came, she stood and launched into a bizarre rant about neighborhood unity, community standards, and personal responsibility. She brought up my pool, claimed it set a bad tone for the area, and that I'd been disruptive and arrogant. Her voice grew louder and more theatrical until it was borderline performance art. She ended her speech with a dramatic quote about order and law, then folded her arms triumphantly. That's when I stood up. I introduced myself and passed copies of my property documents to the board. I explained that I had never been part of the HOA and that Karen had not only filed a false police report, but had impersonated their authority and tried to enforce made-up rules. Then I played a snippet of my security footage, the one of her sneaking around at night and stuffing my mailbox. The room erupted. Some gasped. A few laughed. Karen went pale. Janet took the floor next. She confirmed that Karen had been removed from all HOA positions and had been warned several times to stop these antics. She announced that the board would be taking legal steps to ensure no further impersonation occurred. Karen tried to speak, but no one let her. The meeting ended with murmurs, shaking heads, and more than a few chuckles. Karen stormed out before it was officially adjourned. Later that night, I checked my security cam footage again. Karen was back. Only this time, she stood outside the gate, staring at the house. Not moving. Just glaring. For a good 2 minutes before walking off. I didn't feel fear. I felt something else. The deep, peaceful satisfaction of knowing the tide had turned. She'd picked the wrong target, and she was finally starting to realize it. 2 days after the infamous HOA meeting, the sound of power tools jolted me out of bed before sunrise. At first, I thought it was someone fixing a deck or working on a roof. But as I stepped out onto my back porch with a cup of coffee in hand, I saw something that made me stop mid-sip. Karen was supervising 2 men who were drilling posts into the ground just outside my fence, right along the shared gravel path. They were putting up what looked like the start of a tall privacy barrier. One of the workers was holding a printed sign that read, "Restricted access, HOA members only." The other was hauling bags of concrete. Karen had her arms crossed, nodding like a foreman on a mission. I walked up and leaned over my fence. Fence. Karen spotted me instantly and pointed with her clipboard like I was a trespasser at a construction site. "This is to protect the community," she barked. "Non-members should not have visibility or access to amenities they refuse to support." I blinked. Visibility. She was building a wall to block her own view of my pool, or more likely, to block the imaginary view of my pool she thought should belong to the HOA. I asked her if she had a permit. She said she didn't need one because it was temporary fencing. I pointed out that she was putting concrete in the ground. Her response was to turn her back to me and start yelling about community code. The structure went up fast. Within hours, they had a wooden frame complete with a gaudy vinyl banner stretched across it, declaring the section of the neighborhood as a members-only recreational sideline. It was absurd. The thing looked like a rejected piece of a carnival wall, painted in clashing colors and full of spelling errors. The worst part was that it blocked part of the light that used to hit my pool deck in the afternoon. But I didn't react the way Karen hoped. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I didn't tear it down. I pulled out my phone and started documenting. Later that day, I contacted a licensed land surveyor. I had him come out and mark the exact boundaries of my property, including the easement Karen was now encroaching on. The results came back fast. Her new wall crossed into my property by 6 feet. Not only was it ugly and petty, but it was also illegal. With the evidence in hand, I called the county zoning office. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even mention Karen by name. I calmly explained that a neighbor had installed an unauthorized structure partially on my land. They took my information and said someone would follow up soon. Meanwhile, Karen's war escalated. She started leaving flyers under windshields in the area with a fake HOA seal on them, urging neighbors to report pool parties, unauthorized sunbathing, and excessive water usage. I found one under my own truck's wiper blade that had a list of so-called offenses I'd committed, including aggressive pool splashing and water hogging during drought season. That same afternoon, I hosted a small barbecue, just to spite her. A few friends, some ribs on the grill, music playing low. Karen stood behind her new wall, peeking through a badly cut square she called a compliance window. Every few minutes, she'd pop her head up and take pictures. One of my guests shouted out, "Hey neighbor, enjoying the view?" Everyone burst out laughing. Karen disappeared behind the wall for the rest of the day. 2 mornings later, a county inspector arrived. I walked him around to the back and showed him the footage, the documents, and the line markers from the survey. He jotted everything down, nodded a lot, and left without saying much. I didn't hear anything for 48 hours. Then one evening, a large yellow paper was taped to the front of Karen's precious wall. I saw it while mowing the lawn and stopped to read it. It was a formal demolition notice. The county had reviewed the complaint, verified the property line encroachment, and given her 7 days to take it down or face fines. Karen saw me reading it. She came out of her house like a volcano in a floral blouse. She screamed about sabotage, about conspiracies, about how I had corrupted the board and tricked the inspector. I just waved and walked away. That night, the neighborhood group chat lit up with screenshots of the notice. Someone made a meme out of it. ***, Karen versus the wall. By the next day, the wall had been covered in cardboard to hide the notice. But people just peeled it back and laughed harder. True to form, Karen did not remove the wall. On the morning of the 8th day, a crew showed up in a city-marked truck with tools and gloves. Karen came out flailing papers, yelling about appeals and legal rights. But the crew ignored her. They started unscrewing panels while she stood in front of the fence like a human shield. One of the workers politely asked her to step aside. She didn't. So the sheriff was called, the same officer from the pool incident. He gave Karen one last warning. She refused. He stepped forward, gently guided her out of the way, and she stood on the sidewalk, muttering threats into her phone. Within an hour, the wall was gone. The sun hit my pool again. The banner was crumpled in a pile next to Karen's driveway. And all that was left was a crooked plastic sign that had once read Community Unity, but now just said Calm Yuri. Fitting, really? That night, I sat outside in a lounge chair, feet in the water, beer in hand. I watched the sunset without a wall blocking it. For a moment, everything was calm. But I knew Karen wasn't finished. She never took a loss quietly. And I had a feeling her next move would be even more ridiculous. I leaned back, smiling. Let her try. I had cameras. I had paperwork. I had half the neighborhood quietly rooting for me. But more than that, I had patience. And Karen had no idea how to fight someone who did. Didn't play by her imaginary rulebook. 3 days after the demolition of the infamous wall, I found a manila envelope shoved under my front door. No postage, no return address. Inside was a stack of photocopied papers, each one messier than the last. At the top of the pile was a handwritten note in slanted block letters that read, "See you in court." I flipped through the packet and immediately burst out laughing. Karen had officially filed a lawsuit against me in small claims court, accusing me of harassment, emotional distress, and what she dramatically labeled reputation sabotage. She claimed I had caused irreversible damage to her standing in the community through public humiliation and unlawful behavior. I hadn't even gotten to the part where she wanted me to pay $5,000 for pain and suffering before I realized This was real. She had actually taken this mess to court. I called the clerk's office to confirm. Sure enough, there was a hearing scheduled for the following week. I asked if she had legal representation. She didn't. Of course she didn't. Karen was representing herself, which gave me a strange combination of amusement and secondhand embarrassment. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I gathered every bit of footage, every fake violation notice she'd made, every phony HOA letter, the survey results, the demolition order, and the restraining warning I'd requested after the wall incident. I even had screenshots from the neighborhood group chat where multiple people confirmed they'd been harassed by Karen over the years. The day of the hearing was bizarre from the moment I parked. Karen was already standing outside the courthouse steps, wearing a navy blue blazer that still had a price tag flapping near her hip. She had a giant binder tucked under her arm and a coffee she barely sipped as she paced. When she saw me, she pointed and shouted to no one in particular, "There he is, the menace of Maple Ridge." I gave her a polite wave and walked past her without a word. Inside the courtroom, things only got stranger. The judge was a tired man in his 60s who looked like he'd seen one too many neighbor disputes in his lifetime. He called the case, and we were told to sit. Karen opened with what she called her victim impact statement. It included phrases like visual trauma from pool displays and emotional corrosion from public ridicule. She referred to the torn-down wall as a peace structure and called my property an anti-community zone. The judge's eyebrows climbed so high, I thought they might escape his forehead. When it was my turn, I remained calm and factual. I presented my survey, my property deed, the video evidence, and the footage of Karen screaming at the county workers during the demolition. I walked through the timeline from the false 911 call to the fake notices to the attempted wall installation. The judge stopped me halfway through and asked if I had proof of Karen posing as an HOA official. I handed him the printed screenshots and videos. He didn't say anything, just flipped through the stack slowly. Then came the most unexpected part. One of the Real HOA board members had come to observe. She stood up and asked if she could speak. The judge allowed it. She confirmed that Karen had been removed from all HOA responsibilities years ago and had been warned multiple times to stop acting on behalf of the board. She said Karen's actions had caused confusion, frustration, and a spike in complaints. It wasn't just me. Karen had targeted anyone who didn't fit into her fantasy of a picture-perfect neighborhood under her control. The judge asked one last question before wrapping it up. He turned to Karen and said simply, "Do you have any evidence that this man broke the law or caused you harm?" Karen opened her binder, flipped through pages like she was searching for treasure, and finally held up a blurry photo of me floating in my pool. She said the photo was proof of community disrespect. The judge stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then he sighed and issued his ruling. He dismissed the case entirely and declared that Karen had filed a frivolous claim. He added that, based on the evidence, she had repeatedly harassed a private citizen and abused both HOA representation and legal processes. Then, he did something that made Karen gasp loud enough to echo. He issued a formal restraining order, barring her from any communication or interaction with me, including indirect contact. She was also ordered to pay all court fees and was warned that any further behavior of this kind would result in criminal charges. Karen stood frozen, mouth hanging open, binder slipping from her hand. As we walked out, she tried to say something to me, but the deputy quickly reminded her of the new order. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the heat of her embarrassment trailing me all the way to my truck. As I drove home, I finally let out the full belly laugh I had been holding in for a week. She'd marched into court expecting to win a war and ended up sinking her own ship. The next few days were blissfully quiet. No flyers. No fake notices. No creepy late-night surveillance. It was like the neighborhood had been exorcised. I spent more time outside, enjoying my backyard. Without that constant feeling of being watched, neighbors started dropping by, nodding with approval, some even thanking me for standing up to her. One couple brought over cookies. Another guy gave me a bottle of wine with a note that read, **, for surviving HOA madness. ** Still, I wasn't foolish enough to believe it was over completely. Karen was stubborn, vindictive, a master of finding loopholes. But for now, she had no power left to wield. No made-up laws. No crooked fences. No courtroom speeches. Just silence. And honestly, it was the sweetest silence I'd ever heard. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I stood at the edge of my pool and looked out over the fence line, the same spot where the ridiculous wall once stood. I imagined Karen pacing in her living room, rehearsing a new speech, maybe plotting some fresh nonsense. But it didn't matter anymore. She was out of moves, and I had all the time in the world. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the courtroom disaster that officially shut Karen down. The restraining order was in place. The fake HOA papers had stopped appearing. And my mailbox had finally returned to its original function, holding actual mail instead of handwritten rants and invented fines. The neighborhood had entered a strange state of peace, like a small town after a wildfire. Everything quiet, but scorched. People were cautiously friendly, almost as if they were still testing the air to see if it was safe to breathe again. I didn't blame them. Karen's reign of petty terror had gone on so long that silence felt unnatural. But the story didn't quite end with her vanishing from my yard. Because for someone like Karen, humiliation wasn't a full stop. It was a comma, a pause before a new attempt to reclaim her throne. She didn't confront me anymore, but her absence made people curious. One by one, neighbors started walking by a little slower, making small talk as they casually glanced at her house. Some even came right out and asked what happened. I never shared the full details, but I gave just enough of the facts to let the truth shine through. The video evidence, the fake notices, the wall, the restraining order. It spread faster than gossip usually does in our sleepy area, not because I said much, but because Karen herself had made such a spectacle for so long that her downfall became everyone's entertainment. Then came the online explosion. Someone in the neighborhood, probably one of the younger folks, took clips from the HOA meeting, Karen's courthouse rant, and even some of the group chat screenshots and turned it into a short video. They uploaded it with the title, HOA Karen Gets Exposed in Court, and the internet did what it does best. It went viral. Within a week, the video had hundreds of thousands of views and comments poured in from people around the world. Memes followed. One showed a diagram of Karen's wall labeled Emotional Damage Prevention Shield. Another had a quote bubble over her head that read, */ zone violator. * my favorite was a photo of my pool with a caption, * not your HOA. Not your rules. Not your problem, *. I hadn't expected any of it. I didn't ask for it. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't make me laugh. Even the local news picked up the story. A reporter reached out for a statement, but I declined. I wasn't interested in fame or payback. I just wanted to enjoy my yard without being policed by someone who thought clipboards came with real authority. Still, the internet had declared Karen a symbol. And now, she had to live with it. Which, as it turned out, was harder for her than losing in court. Karen started avoiding everyone. Her curtains stayed closed. Her car was never in the driveway. And some days it looked like no lights were on at all. A few neighbors claimed she was staying with her sister out of town to escape the embarrassment. Others swore they saw her sneaking in and out through the back gate like a character in a crime novel. Either way, she was no longer a presence in our daily lives. The neighborhood slowly began to heal. People put up new decorations. Kids started riding bikes down the sidewalks again, without being scolded for imaginary violations. Even a mailman looked less stressed. To mark the end of the madness, I decided to host a party. But not just any party. A pool party themed around freedom from HOA tyranny. I made custom towels that said pool rules. By me, not Karen. One of my friends brought inflatable flamingos and a shark. Another brought a Bluetooth speaker that played a loop of relaxing ocean waves, interrupted only once by a remix of Karen's courtroom meltdown. We even set up a cardboard cutout of Karen with a word bubble that said, emotional distress loading. Everyone got a picture with it. People showed up in droves. Neighbors I hadn't seen in months came with food, drinks, and stories. Laughter filled the air. Someone flew a drone over the backyard to get shots of the crowd and the pool from above. It was perfect. No stress. No clipboard inspections. No shouting over fences. Just sunshine, burgers, and relief. Toward the end of the evening, as the sky turned gold and the music softened, someone asked if I ever planned to join the HOA now that Karen was out of the picture. I smiled, shook my head, and pointed to a brand new wooden sign I had mounted near the pool gate. It read, "Not part of your HOA. Never was. Never will be. Asterisk, asterisk."
People clapped.
Someone joked that it should be turned into a t-shirt. Maybe it will be, one day. A few days after the party, the for sale sign went up in front of Karen's house. No announcement. No goodbye. Just the quiet appearance of a realtor's placard on her lawn. Rumors flew fast. Some said she was moving across the state. Others whispered that she was selling under pressure from family after the public embarrassment. I didn't ask. I didn't care. All I knew was that the house she once used as a base for her paper empire of nonsense would soon belong to someone new, hopefully someone who didn't think a pool float was a federal offense. When the moving trucks arrived, I didn't watch. I spent the day at the far end of my yard, pruning the garden and listening to birds chirp without interruption. By the time I walked past the front of the house that evening, the driveway was empty and the windows were dark. Karen was gone.
Just like that.
No final speech. No handwritten threat. Just gone. I stood at my gate for a moment, breathing in the quiet. Then I walked back to my porch, sat down, and looked at the sign one more time. Not your HOA. Not your rules. Not your problem. Asterisk, asterisk. It was more than a joke now. It was a reminder. Some battles aren't about winning a war. They're about making it clear that not everyone can be pushed around, that sometimes the loudest person in the room is also the most wrong. And when they finally lose, the silence they leave behind is better than any victory speech.